My phone vibrated against the nightstand like a trapped insect, dragging me out of sleep with that sharp security alert tone I never ignore. I blinked at the screen, expecting a raccoon or wind in the trees, but the live feed opened and my breath locked in my throat. There she was, Clara Whitfield, barefoot, wrapped in a white towel, sitting inside my cedar sauna like she had booked an appointment, swirling a glass of rosé and humming to soft spa music. The blue light from my phone lit the steam rising around her face while my hands started to shake. Then she lifted her own phone and laughed quietly. "It's basically shared land anyway," she whispered. Shared. My stomach went cold. That sauna was not a luxury toy. It was the one place I built with my own hands so my mind could finally be quiet. I did not grab my keys. I did not call her. I watched, and the longer I watched, the clearer it became. This was not her first time. If you want to hear more true stories like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button to Fenceline File Stories. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? Before that night, before the blue glow of my phone turned my stomach inside out, I actually believed I had chosen the perfect place to disappear quietly into my own life. When I bought the house, the edge lot was the deciding factor. It sat just far enough outside the official homeowners association boundary that the paperwork listed it as excluded jurisdiction, a phrase I read 3 times before signing. That line felt like a protective wall. I wasn't trying to rebel against community rules or live recklessly. I just wanted breathing room. After years of noise, deadlines, and the constant hum of other people's expectations, privacy had become more valuable to me than square footage or resale value. The neighborhood itself looked like something from a brochure. Neatly trimmed hedges, identical mailboxes, lawns so evenly cut they almost looked artificial. There was a calm order to it that many people would find comforting. For me, it was impressive from a distance and suffocating up close. My property was tucked behind a thin stretch of cedar trees, just enough natural cover to blur the sightlines from the street. I remember standing in the backyard the first evening after moving in, listening to nothing but wind brushing through leaves, thinking I had finally stepped off the treadmill. The sauna came later, something I'd built myself board by board, less for luxury and more as a ritual space where silence could exist without interruption. The first time I met Clara Whitfield, she arrived with a smile that looked practiced rather than warm. She carried a small basket of baked goods and introduced herself as the board leader for the community side. The emphasis on community lingered longer than necessary. She complimented the trees, the paint color, the layout of the house, but every compliment had a tiny correction attached. "Most people prefer lighter exterior shades here," she said with a polite laugh. "It keeps harmony." At the time, I shrugged it off as harmless neighborhood chatter. People like to feel involved. I thanked her, accepted the cookies, and thought that would be the end of it. It wasn't. Over the next few weeks, Clara developed a pattern of appearing unexpectedly. She would wave while walking her dog and mention small aesthetic standards as if they were universal truths. "Everyone keeps porch lighting warm white here. We try to avoid tall fences. It breaks the visual flow." None of it applied to my property legally, but the repetition planted a subtle pressure. She never outright demanded compliance. She suggested it, gently, persistently, like a drip of water against stone. Not everyone in the neighborhood carried that tone. Oliver Grant lived 2 houses down from the cedar line, a widower with a slow gait and a steady voice. He introduced himself by apologizing for nothing in particular, which somehow made him immediately likable. We talked over the fence once about gardening, another time about the changing weather, and he never once mentioned rules or boards or compliance. Naomi Brooks was the opposite energy, quick, observant, always holding a coffee mug like it was part of her hand. She worked remotely and noticed everything. The first time we spoke, she casually mentioned, "You're technically outside their reach, but some of them forget that on purpose." She said it with a half smile, like she'd seen this play out before. At first, the signs of friction were small enough to dismiss. An email landed in my inbox welcoming me to the extended community, even though I had never provided my address to their mailing list. Another message followed a week later reminding residents about mailbox uniformity. Mine didn't match theirs, but again, it wasn't required to. I ignored it. Then came a printed flyer tucked under my door referencing community harmony guidelines. No direct accusation, just broad language that somehow made you feel singled out without being named. It was clever in a way that made me uneasy. I told myself it was harmless overreach, nothing more. Communities have personalities, and sometimes those personalities lean toward control. Still, I found myself double-checking property lines, rereading purchase documents, noticing how often Clara's car slowed near my driveway. Peace was still there, technically, but it had begun to feel conditional, like a silence that could be broken at any moment. I hated that feeling, because it crept in quietly. I had come here to step away from tension, not negotiate with it. The shift from nostalgia to unease didn't happen in a single moment. It was gradual, almost polite. The trees still swayed the same way in the evening. The air still smelled of cut grass and cedar. But beneath that calm, there was a subtle sense of being observed, measured against standards I had never agreed to. Naomi's earlier comment replayed in my head more often. Some of them forget on purpose. I started wondering whether forgetting was accidental or strategic. The first formal notice arrived on a Tuesday morning, slipped into a clear plastic sleeve and taped squarely to my front door like a badge of accusation. It wasn't about noise or property lines or anything substantial. It was a complaint about the placement of a small wooden sign near my driveway, one that simply read, "Private Property." According to the notice, the sign was inconsistent with neighborhood visual cohesion. I stood there holding the paper, reading the same sentence twice, and felt that quiet peace I had worked so hard to build tilt slightly off balance. It was absurd on its face, but it carried the unmistakable scent of escalation. The envelope was thicker than the first notice, heavier in a way that felt intentional, like weight alone could manufacture authority. It sat perfectly centered on my doorstep, the HOA logo printed in bold navy ink across the top. I already knew what it was before I opened it. The paper inside was formal, sterile, and full of legal-sounding phrases that tried very hard to sound final. Violation of community aesthetic standards. Unauthorized signage. Mandatory corrective action required. The sign they were referring to was a small wooden plaque near my driveway that simply read, "Privaprpat property." No flashing lights, no aggressive wording, just a boundary stated plainly. Yet the letter framed it as disruptive, visually inconsistent, and subject to escalating fines if not removed within 7 days. I stood there reading it while the morning air still carried the smell of wet grass. My first reaction was disbelief. My second was clarity. This was not about a sign. It was about testing how far they could reach before I pushed back. The paper included a meeting date at the bottom, a line about community review, and a polite suggestion that my presence would be beneficial. It wasn't a request. It was a summons dressed in courtesy. For 2 days, I debated ignoring it. Legally, I could have. My property documents were clear, but ignoring it felt like surrendering the narrative, letting them talk about me instead of to me. So on Thursday evening, I walked into the community clubhouse with a small folder under my arm and my phone in my pocket. The room smelled faintly of coffee and furniture polish. Rows of folding chairs faced a long table where the board members sat with clipboards and printed agendas. Clara Whitfield was in the center seat, posture straight, smile already in place like she had rehearsed it. She greeted me with that same polished friendliness from our first meeting, the kind that never reached her eyes. "Mason, glad you could make it," she said, as if I had come voluntarily to a social event. The sign violation appeared midway through the agenda. When my name was called, I stood slowly, aware of the dozen or so neighbors watching. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't argue about jurisdiction. I simply said, "Before we discuss signage, I think context matters." Then I tapped my phone and connected it to the projector cable Naomi had quietly handed me a few minutes earlier. The security footage filled the screen. The timestamp glowed in the corner, Clara walking through my back gate. Clara opening the sauna door. Clara sitting inside with a glass in her hand, steam curling around her shoulders while spa music drifted faintly through the tiny speaker she had brought with her. The room shifted. It wasn't loud at first, just a collective intake of breath, the kind people make when they realize they're seeing something they weren't supposed to see. Someone near the back whispered, "Is that his place?" Another voice murmured, "That's not common property." I didn't embellish. I let the video run. Clara's voice on her phone saying, "It's basically shared land anyway," echoed through the small speakers. When the clip ended, silence settled over the room like dust after a fall. The sign suddenly seemed very small compared to what everyone had just watched. Clara recovered quickly. "I'll give her that." She leaned forward, fingers interlaced, expression composed. "This is, out of context," she said, each word measured. "I was conducting an informal visual inspection. Community adjacency can sometimes create shared maintenance concerns." The phrasing was impressive if you didn't listen too closely. It sounded official without actually saying anything concrete. She smiled at the room as if expecting agreement, as if language alone could rewind what they had just seen. That was when Oliver Grant raised his hand. Oliver rarely spoke in meetings, which made the sound of his chair scraping against the floor more noticeable. "With respect," he said, voice calm but firm, "walking into someone's private structure without permission is trespassing. Inspection or not?" A few heads nodded. Naomi followed with a quiet comment about how she had received 3 warning emails over mailbox paint while never seeing a written rule. A young couple mentioned being cited for balloons at their child's birthday party. None of these grievances were dramatic on their own, but together they formed a pattern that people could finally see instead of just feel. I watched Clara's expression tighten by a fraction of an inch. The room wasn't turning hostile, but it was no longer automatically aligned with her. Social gravity had shifted. The authority she relied on was suddenly conditional, dependent on the perception of fairness rather than the title on her nameplate. I realized then that exposure had power, but it wasn't decisive power. People were uncomfortable, yes. They were questioning, yes. But discomfort alone doesn't dismantle someone who believes they are the system. When the discussion circled back to my sign, the energy had changed. The board members spoke more cautiously, glancing at Clara before forming sentences. I reiterated the legal boundary of my property without raising my voice. I thanked them for their time. I didn't push for apologies or victories. I simply presented facts and allowed them to exist in the open air. The meeting moved on, but the tension lingered like static. As chairs folded and conversations broke into small clusters, Clara approached me near the exit. Her smile returned, thinner now, stretched tight. "We'll be conducting further review," she said quietly, tone wrapped in politeness but edged with steel. Enforcement procedures exist for a reason. It wasn't a shout. It wasn't a threat you could quote directly. It was worse, an implication delivered with perfect calm. I nodded once and stepped outside into the cool night, understanding something with absolute certainty. Showing the truth had changed the room, but it had not changed her. This wasn't finished. It had only just begun. The week after the meeting didn't explode all at once. It tightened, like a rope slowly being pulled from several directions at the same time. The first new notice appeared in my email inbox at 6 in the morning, stamped with the same HOA logo and filled with the same careful language. This time it wasn't about the sign. It was about the height of my shrubs along the back fence, shrubs that had not changed in months. 2 days later another arrived, referencing unverified exterior modifications. I walked outside and looked around, half expecting to see something physically different, but the house stood exactly as it had the day I bought it. The citations weren't about reality anymore. They were about presence. A reminder that eyes were on me. Then the rumors started. They didn't come directly. They floated through indirect conversations and half-sentences Naomi overheard while walking her dog. Someone had mentioned I was difficult. Another claimed I was trying to avoid paying community fees. A third suggested I was not cooperative with neighborhood standards. None of it was loud, but it traveled fast because it was vague. Vague statements let people fill in their own fears. It was clever social pressure. Nothing provable, nothing confrontational, just a fog of doubt settling over ordinary interactions. I noticed neighbors who used to wave now offering polite nods instead, their smiles thinner, uncertain. A white SUV began appearing near the cedar line twice a week. The first time I assumed it was lost. The second time I recognized the clipboard on the passenger seat. 2 men stepped out, measured something near the fence, wrote notes, and left without knocking. I watched through the window, feeling the strange helplessness of seeing strangers inspect property they had no authority over. When I later asked the HOA office for clarification, the response came 2 days later in a generic email. Our routine visual assessments for community cohesion. No names, no accountability. Just language designed to sound official without being specific. I tried peaceful channels first because I wanted a clean record. I contacted the county zoning office, attached my property documents, and asked for confirmation regarding jurisdiction. The automated reply arrived immediately, cheerful and useless. The real response came a week later, a short paragraph thanking me for my inquiry and suggesting I coordinate directly with community leadership. It was a bureaucratic loop. Every door led back to the same hallway. The system wasn't hostile. It was indifferent, and indifference can feel colder than opposition because it offers no resistance to push against, just emptiness. Naomi's harassment started subtly. A printed reminder appeared on her door about trash bin placement even though her bins were already aligned with the curb like everyone else's. Then came an email about excessive exterior noise sent on a day she had been wearing headphones all afternoon. She laughed it off when she told me, but her eyes held the tightness of someone who understood the pattern. Oliver's situation cut deeper. He received a violation notice for a wreath hanging on his front door, one that had been there for months. It was a simple arrangement of dried lavender and ribbon placed in memory of his late wife. The notice described it as seasonally inconsistent decor. When he showed it to me, he didn't speak for a full 10 seconds. The silence carried more weight than anger ever could. The emotional toll crept into the hours no one sees. I started waking at 3 in the morning to check camera feeds, convincing myself I had heard something outside. The blue glow of the monitor became a nightly companion, illuminating the room while the rest of the house slept. I told myself I was just being cautious, but the truth was more uncomfortable. I was being conditioned to expect intrusion. My shoulders stayed tight even when nothing was happening. Simple tasks, making coffee, watering plants, carried an undercurrent of vigilance that didn't belong there. Peace had not vanished. It had been diluted until it barely tasted like itself. Days blended together in a strange rhythm of normalcy and quiet pressure. I would mow the lawn and feel watched. I would open my mailbox and feel anticipation instead of neutrality. Conversations with neighbors became coded, filled with phrases like, just in case, and better safe than sorry. The environment hadn't changed physically, yet the atmosphere had shifted into something heavier, harder to breathe. The letter arrived on a Friday afternoon, thicker than the others, and printed on cream-colored paper that tried very hard to look official. It wasn't a citation. It was a cease and desist notice claiming I was engaging in hostile non-compliance and visual disruption of community standards. The language was elaborate, packed with legal terms that overlapped without actually connecting. It demanded removal of my signage, submission to inspection scheduling, and written acknowledgement of HOA authority within 10 days. At the bottom was a signature that looked photocopied rather than inked, followed by the name of a law office I had never heard of. I read it once, standing by the door. I read it again at the kitchen table. The wording wasn't just stern, it was coordinated. The citations, the rumors, the inspections, the neighbor pressure, they weren't isolated incidents anymore. They were parts of the same machine, each small enough to deny but together forming a clear pattern. This wasn't random enforcement. It was organized pressure designed to exhaust, confuse, and isolate. And as I set the paper down, the realization settled in with a clarity that cut through every previous doubt. I wasn't dealing with misunderstandings or overzealous bureaucracy. I was facing a deliberate campaign. The intimidation letter sat on my table for 2 days before I answered it, not with anger and not with silence, but with preparation. What Clara and the board didn't know, what I had never mentioned in meetings or casual conversations, was that I had been archiving everything since the first odd email months ago. Every notice, every flyer, every time-stamped security clip, every interaction logged with dates and screenshots. At first it had been a habit born from caution, the same instinct that makes you double-lock a door without thinking. But somewhere along the way it had turned into a quiet record of patterns. and patterns, when lined up correctly, tell stories that single incidents never can. Julian Reeves had been that voice of calm on the other end of my phone for weeks. We went back years, long before this house, long before cedar trees and community boards. He specialized in property and nuisance law, the kind of legal terrain most people never think about until they are already knee-deep in it. Our calls were never dramatic. He didn't give speeches or grand predictions. He asked for documents, timestamps, jurisdiction lines, and then he asked for more. Keep everything, he had told me early on, not because you want to fight, but because clarity is armor. The day after the letter arrived, I drove to his office with a binder thick enough to make a statement without a single raised voice. He flipped through the pages slowly, occasionally tapping a finger against the margins where dates lined up too neatly to be coincidence. The footage of Clara entering my property appeared on his screen again, and this time I watched it without the surge of anger that had first accompanied it. The emotion had cooled into something steadier, something useful. Julian leaned back after nearly an hour and said the sentence that shifted everything. They exceeded jurisdiction repeatedly, not possibly, not arguably, repeatedly. Repeatedly. The word landed with weight because it wasn't emotional, it was factual. He pointed to sections in my purchase documents and compared them with the HOA bylaws. The lines didn't just blur, they never touched. The board's authority ended well before my fence line, yet the notices kept crossing it. The inspections. The letters. Even the language in their emails implied control they did not legally possess. It wasn't just overreach. It was documented overreach. Driving home, the frustration I had been carrying for weeks rearranged itself. Up to that point, I had been reacting, responding to letters, attending meetings, defending small pieces of ground one at a time. Reaction is exhausting because it always starts one step behind. Strategy, on the other hand, begins from stillness. I remember sitting in my car in the driveway with the engine off, the late afternoon sun cutting long shadows through the cedar branches, and feeling a sentence form in my head with surprising clarity. Enough. Not shouted, not whispered. Just decided. The plan that emerged wasn't about revenge or confrontation. I didn't want screaming matches on sidewalks or viral videos of public arguments. Noise would only feed the narrative that I was difficult. What I wanted was consequence without chaos. Something legal. Something undeniable. Something that forced self-reflection rather than allowed deflection. Julian had warned me to stay inside the lines, and I intended to stay so clearly inside them that the lines themselves became the message. The idea came from an unexpected place. A conversation weeks earlier with a friend who worked in wildlife management. He had mentioned scent deterrent systems designed to keep raccoons and coyotes away from storage areas. They were legal, non-toxic, and unbelievably effective because they relied on instinct rather than force. I remembered laughing at the description back then. Now the memory returned with a different weight, not as a joke, as a tool. I researched the devices carefully. They weren't traps. They didn't harm anything. They simply released an extremely unpleasant odor when motion sensors detected entry into a restricted area. Farmers used them near barns. Campgrounds used them near supply sheds. The science behind them was straightforward. No chemicals that lingered, no damage, just temporary discomfort strong enough to discourage repeat behavior. It wasn't aggressive. It was boundary enforcement in its purest form. Installing the system became a quiet ritual. I mounted the small diffuser beneath the sauna bench where it couldn't be seen but would function effectively in an enclosed space. The motion sensor was calibrated to detect human-sized movement rather than small animals. Cameras were adjusted to capture clear angles without invading anyone else's privacy. Every step I took, I documented. Receipts saved. Serial numbers logged, settings photographed. If anyone ever questioned it, the evidence would show intention rooted in legality, not malice. There was a strange calm that settled over me during those hours of setup. The anxiety that had kept me awake at night softened into focus. I wasn't waiting anymore. I wasn't wondering what the next letter would say or who would appear near the fence. I was creating a system that didn't rely on confrontation or persuasion. A boundary that spoke for itself. When the final connection synced to my phone and the small icon glowed green on the screen, I stood back and looked at the sauna door for a long moment. Nothing about it had changed visually. The cedar board still carried that warm, earthy scent. The latch still clicked the same way, but beneath the surface, a line had been drawn with precision rather than anger. A hidden switch existed now, one that didn't punish, didn't injure, didn't escalate. It simply ensured that if someone chose to cross into a space they had no right to enter, the consequence would arrive instantly and without argument. I locked the gate, slipped my phone into my pocket, and walked back toward the house with a feeling I hadn't experienced in weeks. Not victory. Not relief. Control. Quiet, steady control. The next move would not be mine to chase. It would be theirs to trigger. Once the switch was in place, I didn't relax. Preparation isn't a single act, it's a phase. The difference now was that my energy no longer scattered in every direction. It moved in straight lines. I upgraded the camera system the following weekend, not out of paranoia but precision. The older cameras had served their purpose, but they left blind spots where shadows pooled near the cedar trunks and the side gate hinge. The new units were small, matte black, almost invisible against the wood grain, and they captured wide angles without distortion. I positioned them carefully, one above the sauna door, one angled along the fence line, and another overlooking the path that curved from the back of the house toward the trees. Every installation came with timestamps and serial numbers saved into a digital folder labeled simply Property Records. Nothing aggressive, just meticulous. The deterrent system received the same attention. I tested the motion calibration in daylight and again at night, walking the perimeter myself to confirm sensitivity. The device released nothing during tests because it was set to silent verification mode, but the notification ping on my phone told me the sensors were working. Each small confirmation added a layer of certainty. The system wasn't a weapon. It was documentation in physical form, a boundary that logged every crossing without needing my presence. At the same time, conversations with neighbors shifted from casual to intentional. I didn't approach anyone asking for loyalty or confrontation. I asked for clarity. Naomi invited me over one evening and showed me a stack of printed emails she had kept for months. Warnings about noise on days she hadn't even been home. Reminders about community spirit, attached to vague suggestions of compliance. Oliver brought out a small folder from his living room cabinet, hands steady but eyes tired. The notice about his memorial wreath sat on top, followed by 2 more letters about lawn edging that had never changed. None of these incidents alone could shake an institution. Together, they formed a pattern too consistent to dismiss as coincidence. I digitized everything with their permission. Screenshots, scanned documents, brief written statements in their own words. No embellishment. No emotional language, just facts aligned in chronological order. The evidence package grew steadily, not dramatic in appearance but powerful in its quiet uniformity. Dates repeated. Names repeated. Phrases repeated. When you see repetition in authority, you begin to understand that control often relies on people believing they are isolated. The moment isolation dissolves, the system loses its invisibility. Meanwhile, Clara's confidence expanded rather than shrank. The meeting where I had shown the footage seemed to have convinced her not to retreat but to speak louder. I overheard fragments of conversations in the parking lot after community gatherings, her voice carrying just far enough to be heard. "We maintain order here," she would say, or "community standards protect property value." The phrasing always emphasized collective good while quietly placing herself at the center of it. She began referring to my lot as adjacent compliance territory. A term so carefully invented it almost sounded legitimate. Overconfidence has a distinct texture. It smooths out hesitation and replaces it with certainty that feels unbreakable until the moment it isn't. My evenings became structured rituals. After dinner, I reviewed camera logs, not obsessively but methodically. I cross-referenced dates from neighbor testimonies with the HOA's notice timeline. Julian checked in twice a week, never pushing, always asking the same grounded questions. "Is everything documented? Are you staying within the lines?" The answer became easier to give each time. Yes. Yes. Always yes. The evidence package eventually filled 2 digital folders and 1 physical binder thick enough to require a label on the spine. It wasn't a weapon. It was gravity, something that would pull truth downward the moment it was released. The HOA announced an emergency review meeting 3 weeks after the intimidation letter. The notice arrived via email and printed flyer, framed as a community alignment session. The phrasing was softer than previous communications, almost conciliatory, but the timing was unmistakable. It was scheduled for the following Friday evening, the same week my documentation would be finalized and my deterrent system fully active. Reading the announcement, I felt an odd calm instead of dread. They believed the meeting would consolidate their position. I recognized it as a stage where facts could stand without interruption. Neighbors reacted with mixed emotions. Some expressed relief, hoping the meeting meant the tension would settle. Others sensed it was an escalation disguised as resolution. Naomi texted me a simple line. "They think they're closing the door." Oliver, ever steady, said, "Doors swing both ways." Their words didn't carry bravado. They carried awareness. Awareness is quieter than anger, but far more durable. In the days leading up to that week, Clara's public tone grew almost celebratory. She spoke about restoring balance and clarifying authority, as if outcomes were already written. The white SUV returned twice more to the fence line, each visit shorter than the last, as though the act of appearing mattered more than the measurements themselves. Every appearance, every letter, every conversation entered the log. No confrontation, no argument, just accumulation. By Wednesday night, the binder closed with a soft thud that sounded final. Cameras were synced, deterrents calibrated, testimonies filed, legal consultations complete. Nothing outwardly dramatic had happened, yet everything essential had shifted beneath the surface. I stood in the backyard for a long moment, listening to the wind move through the cedar branches the way it had on the day I first arrived. The environment hadn't changed. The dynamics had. What struck me most was the symmetry of it all. On one side, Clara and the board prepared presentations, talking points, and authority language designed to reinforce their position. On the other side, I prepared facts, footage, and boundaries that required no persuasion. Neither side knew the full extent of the other's readiness. Neither side understood that the coming days would converge into a single decisive week. We were both moving pieces into place, convinced we were shaping the outcome, unaware that the board itself had already been set. The emergency meeting drew a larger crowd than any gathering I had seen since moving into the neighborhood. Cars lined both sides of the street outside the clubhouse, headlights cutting across trimmed hedges and identical mailboxes like search beams. Inside, the air carried the low hum of anticipation, the kind that settles before a storm when people aren't sure whether to seek shelter or stay and watch. Chairs filled quickly, and late arrivals stood along the walls pretending they were only there out of curiosity. No one said it out loud, but everyone understood that this wasn't a routine alignment session. It was a confrontation wearing a polite name tag. Clara Whitfield stood at the front of the room with a posture that radiated control. She wore a tailored blazer and held a clipboard like a symbol rather than a tool. Her smile appeared measured, practiced in the mirror of certainty. She greeted people by name as they entered, offering brief reassurances about clarity and moving forward together. The phrasing was gentle, but it carried the assumption that direction had already been decided. Authority often presents itself as inevitability, and Clara had mastered that tone. I chose a seat near the middle, not hidden and not prominent. Visibility without spotlight. My phone rested in my hand, screen dark, notifications muted. Calm doesn't always come naturally. Sometimes it's constructed from preparation. Weeks earlier, I would have scanned the room for allies or signs of hostility. Now I observed quietly, noting how people grouped themselves, who sat together, who avoided eye contact, who whispered. Rumors had been circulating all week. Some said I was planning legal action. Others suggested the board was preparing fines large enough to force compliance. The truth existed somewhere outside those extremes, but rumors rarely seek truth. They seek movement. Naomi slipped into the seat beside me with a soft nod. Oliver arrived a few minutes later, taking a chair near the aisle. Their presence wasn't dramatic, it was grounding. Around us, conversations flickered in fragments. Did you hear about the letters? I heard inspections are expanding. He has cameras everywhere. The words floated without owners, shaping the room's emotional temperature. Tension doesn't always rise in volume. Sometimes it spreads in quiet layers until the air feels thicker. When the meeting began, Claire opened with a speech about unity and shared responsibility. Her voice was steady, confident, each sentence landing with deliberate rhythm. She spoke about preserving property values, about community identity, about the necessity of standards. Nothing she said was overtly hostile. That was her skill. The language of control often disguises itself as protection. She never mentioned my name at first, but the glances toward my section of the room made the subject clear without requiring direct reference. I kept my attention on the cadence rather than the content. Words are easier to predict than reactions. My thumb brushed the edge of my phone once, waking the screen just long enough to confirm the green status icon of the motion system. Ready. The single word settled into my chest like a steady heartbeat. I locked the screen again and returned my gaze to the front of the room. Midway through the agenda, Clara shifted tone. The softness thinned. She referenced ongoing non-compliance in adjacent properties, and the potential need for property penalties if cooperative alignment fails. The phrasing was careful, but the implication was unmistakable. Penalties. Enforcement. Consequences framed as administrative necessities rather than choices. A few murmurs rippled through the chairs. Naomi exhaled slowly beside me. Oliver's jaw tightened just enough to notice. Clara's confidence remained unbroken, buoyed by the assumption that authority, once spoken, would anchor itself in the room. Questions followed, most of them cautious. Neighbors asked about clarification timelines, about inspection procedures, about whether notices could be appealed. Clara answered each with composed patience, reinforcing structure without yielding ground. She was building a narrative where compliance equaled harmony and resistance equaled disruption. It was effective because it appealed to collective comfort. People prefer stability, even when it comes wrapped in restrictions, as long as the restrictions appear evenly distributed. I said nothing. Silence can be misread as weakness or interpreted as certainty. The difference lies in context. Tonight it served as space room for others to reveal their positions without prompting. The evidence binder stayed in my bag. The cameras at home recorded empty pathways. The deterrent system waited without impatience. Strategy isn't loud, it's timed. As the meeting edged toward its conclusion, Clara straightened her papers and delivered what sounded like a closing reassurance. "We'll be conducting additional private inspections this weekend," she announced, voice smooth, almost casual, "just to ensure alignment and avoid unnecessary escalation." The sentence drifted across the room with the lightness of routine, but its meaning carried weight. Private inspections. Weekend. Alignment. The words arranged themselves into an unintended confession of intent. A few neighbors nodded as if the announcement promised order. Others exchanged uncertain looks. I felt Naomi glance toward me, felt Oliver's gaze shift in quiet understanding. I didn't move. I didn't react. My phone remained still in my hand, its dark screen hiding the readiness beneath. Clara smiled once more, satisfied, unaware that the statement she had delivered as assurance had just drawn a clear line toward the very boundary she believed she controlled. The meeting adjourned with polite applause that sounded more like release than agreement. Chairs scraped back, conversations resumed, and people filtered toward the exits carrying their own interpretations of what had just transpired. I stood slowly, letting the flow move ahead of me. Outside, the night air felt cooler than before, the cedar trees whispering the same steady rhythm they always had. Nothing visible had changed, yet the week ahead had quietly crystallized into something inevitable. Clara believed she had reinforced her authority. In reality, she had scheduled her own test, sealing the timing with a confidence that left no room for reconsideration. Saturday evening arrived with the kind of quiet that usually feels peaceful, but that night carried a different weight. The sky was clear, the air cool enough to keep the cedar scent hanging low across the yard. I wasn't pacing or watching the monitors obsessively. Preparation had replaced anxiety with patience. The cameras were live, the sensors calibrated, the evidence organized. All I had to do now was wait and refuse the temptation to interfere with my own plan. The notification came just after dusk. A single vibration against my palm, the screen lighting up with the rear camera feed. Clara Whitfield stepped through the side gate with the confidence of someone performing a routine rather than committing a violation. She didn't look around the way people usually do when they know they're trespassing. She moved with familiarity, adjusting the strap of a small bag on her shoulder as if she were returning to a place she believed she had a right to enter. The sauna door opened. Steam drifted out in a slow curl, and she slipped inside without hesitation. I didn't rush. The camera inside captured the full scene, her setting her phone on the bench, adjusting the speaker, exhaling in that exaggerated way people do when they think they've earned relaxation. The same casual entitlement from the first footage replayed itself almost perfectly, as if repetition alone could transform private space into shared property. I watched the timestamp advance by seconds. 10, 15, 20. Long enough for certainty. Long enough to remove any possibility of misunderstanding. My thumb tapped the small green icon on my screen. There was no explosion, no dramatic noise. The system released a concentrated wave of scent designed not to injure but to repel. The change in Clara's expression was immediate. Her shoulders lifted, her nose wrinkled, confusion flashing across her face before recognition arrived. She stood abruptly, knocking her phone sideways, and reached for the door. The enclosed warmth of the sauna amplified the effect just enough to turn discomfort into urgency. The door stuck for 2 seconds. Ordinary friction made extraordinary by panic, and when it opened, she burst out into the evening air, coughing and waving her hands as if the atmosphere itself had betrayed her. The cameras caught everything. The stumble down the steps. The frantic attempts to fan the air away. The half-formed accusations spoken to no one in particular. It wasn't cruelty. It wasn't violence. It was consequence, brief, harmless, and entirely triggered by her own choice to cross a boundary she had been warned about repeatedly. I remained inside the house, watching through glass and pixels, allowing the moment to unfold without commentary. The system reset automatically. The yard returned to silence within minutes. The police arrived less than 20 minutes later, summoned by Clara's complaint. Their cruiser lights washed the hedges in alternating blue and red while she spoke rapidly, pointing toward the sauna with the intensity of someone trying to shape reality through volume. I stepped outside only when they approached the door, binder already in my hand. Calm travels faster than agitation when facts are present. I invited them to review the footage. No speeches. No accusations. Just a screen, a timeline, and an unedited record of entry, trigger, and exit. The officers watched in silence. One of them paused the clip and rewound it twice, confirming the gate opening, the interior entry, the absence of any direct confrontation. The other officer glanced at the property documents I provided, noting the jurisdiction boundary with a short nod. Their demeanor shifted from cautious neutrality to professional clarity. Clara's narrative lost momentum not because it was argued against, but because it dissolved under verification. She was warned formally about trespassing and advised that the device was legal, non-toxic, and well within property rights. The conversation ended with procedural calm rather than dramatic flourish, which somehow made the outcome feel even more final. What neither of us expected was how quickly the footage spread. I hadn't posted it, but several neighbors had already heard the commotion and requested to see what had happened. By the next morning, fragments of the clip circulated through private community chats. The reaction wasn't cruel laughter or spectacle. It was recognition, an acknowledgement that the pattern people had felt for months now had visible proof. Social gravity shifted again, this time decisively. Clara's authority had depended on perception, and perception had just been rewritten by clarity rather than rumor. The emergency meeting reconvened that afternoon with a crowd twice the size of the previous one. This time, the atmosphere was not charged with uncertainty, but with resolution. The footage was displayed on the projector without commentary, the timestamp glowing steadily in the corner. No one needed persuasion. The evidence spoke with its own cadence. Neighbors who had once whispered now stood and described their own experiences. Letters over trivial decor, inspections that crossed boundaries, conversations that blurred suggestion into demand. Each testimony added weight, not through volume but through alignment. When the vote for leadership review was called, the outcome was swift. Hands rose across the room with little hesitation. Clara sat rigidly at the front table, the clipboard that once symbolized certainty now resting unused against the wood. The motion passed with a margin so clear it required no recount. Her removal from the board was effective immediately, recorded in the minutes with the same formal language she had once relied upon. There were no cheers, no applause, only a collective exhale that sounded like tension finally releasing from a long-held breath. She left the room without addressing anyone, her steps quick but measured, dignity clinging to posture even as authority slipped away. Public credibility doesn't shatter with noise, it erodes when facts align against it. By the time the doors closed behind her, the atmosphere had changed from confrontation to quiet restoration. The conflict itself was over. The consequences had been delivered not through shouting or spectacle, but through documentation and timing. Emotional closure, however, still waited beyond the room, saved for a quieter moment that had not yet arrived. The weeks that followed did not arrive with fireworks or dramatic announcements. They arrived quietly, the way real change usually does. The new board leadership was installed within days, and the difference was noticeable almost immediately. Meetings became shorter, language became clearer, and notices, when they appeared at all, were specific rather than vague. The atmosphere around the neighborhood shifted from guarded politeness to something closer to normal human interaction. People waved again without hesitation. Conversations lingered instead of ending quickly. The sense of being watched faded into the background where it belonged. Neighbors began approaching me in small moments rather than grand gestures. Oliver stopped by one afternoon with a simple thank you and a handshake that carried more meaning than a speech ever could. Naomi left a note in my mailbox with nothing but 3 words: "You held the line." Others expressed appreciation indirectly. Extra smiles, brief conversations about gardens or weather, subtle acknowledgments that something heavy had lifted. None of them treated me like a hero, and I was grateful for that. I had never wanted recognition. I had wanted equilibrium. Clara's departure happened without ceremony. A moving truck appeared one morning, its white sides reflecting the same trimmed hedges and identical mailboxes that had once served as her stage. She wore sunglasses and kept her head down, directing movers with short gestures rather than conversations. No one gathered to watch. No one jeered. The absence of spectacle felt appropriate. Authority had left the neighborhood the same way it had arrived, quietly, but with far less certainty. By the end of the day, the driveway was empty, and the house stood still like any other, stripped of the personality that had once filled it so forcefully. My own routine returned in gradual steps. The first evening I walked into the backyard without checking camera feeds beforehand, I noticed the difference immediately. The cedar trees sounded the same as they always had, but the silence between their rustling felt wider, more breathable. I opened the sauna door and let the warm scent of wood settle around me. There was no tension attached to the space anymore, no association with conflict. It was just what it had been intended to be from the beginning, a place where noise ended. Before stepping inside, I replaced the small wooden sign near the driveway. The new one was nearly identical in size but sharper in wording. It didn't shout or threaten. It simply stated boundaries clearly, without apology or decoration. I fastened it to the post with steady hands, not out of defiance but clarity. Boundaries are not barriers meant to isolate. They are lines that allow coexistence without confusion. When they are respected, community becomes possible. When they are ignored, community turns into control. The neighborhood found its rhythm again. A small block gathering formed weeks later. Nothing formal, just folding chairs and shared dishes under string lights. Conversations drifted easily from work to hobbies to harmless neighborhood gossip. What struck me most was not the friendliness, but the absence of tension. People weren't careful with their words anymore. They were simply present. Accountability had not fractured the community. It had refined it, removing the pressure that had been quietly distorting every interaction. Looking back, the conflict never felt like a war in the traditional sense. It was more like a fog that had slowly thickened until visibility disappeared. The solution wasn't louder voices or sharper arguments. It was clarity applied consistently, facts aligned patiently, and consequences delivered without cruelty. Dignity, I realized, doesn't require dominance. It requires steadiness. Community, likewise, doesn't thrive on uniformity. It thrives on mutual respect. On a quiet evening months later, I sat inside the sauna with the door slightly open, letting the cool air mix with the warmth. The world outside sounded ordinary again. Distant laughter, a car door closing, leaves brushing against wood. Nothing dramatic, nothing tense. Just life continuing. The peace I had been searching for hadn't been found in isolation or confrontation. It had been built through boundaries that allowed space for everyone without allowing anyone to take more than their share. Respect, like peace, is not granted by authority. It is earned by accountability and maintained by clarity. If you want to hear more true stories like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button to Fenceline File Stories. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from?